Are we on? Oh, okay.
All right, thank you, Mike. If you're in here for DevOps and you really are dying to see the DevOps talk, it's in Palazzo C. But again, as we've said for other people, this will be worth your time, and you're already here. If you lived here, you would be home by now. So I am Dave Slusher. I'm a developer advocate in the platform business unit here at ServiceNow. And I've been in this role for about 2.5 years. Is that about right? 2.5 years. I've been with ServiceNow approaching 5 years at this point. And Josh, up until very recently, was my partner in crime.
Yeah, and that's me. Am I on? There's no
Bring up Josh, please.
testing. I was making, there we go. I guess we can't talk too close to each other. So I'm Josh Nerius, and like Dave said, up until very recently, I was a developer advocate in the developer program. I'm actually now a product manager in our platform business unit, and I'm primarily focusing on integrations and authentication. We're talking about IntegrationHub today. I happen to now own IntegrationHub, so this is a slightly, it's kind of cool. I get to talk about the product that, from a slightly different perspective. Been doing this for a while, been at ServiceNow for about 4.5 years, was a customer before that, and I have a background in full stack development. We're supposed to put things up here like achievements. I'm platinum in Rocket League if anyone plays the game. But and then current projects, working on the Madrid release. So it's exciting to be here and talk to people and hear what people are looking forward to.
All right. And so here's what we're going to talk about. We did together, and now still occasionally Josh will guest. On Fridays, we do a live streaming show on YouTube and Twitch called Live Coding Happy Hour, which we get together and we pick a problem that matters to us, and we pop open some beers and we drink and code. And it's exactly. And one of the developer managers once said that we were brilliant because we figured out how to drink beer on company time. And I said, the drinking beer isn't the brilliant part. It's the getting paid to drink beer. That's the brilliant part. So we do this live streaming show on YouTube and Twitch. Making it happen in the way that we're doing it is harder than it seems like it should be, particularly like with the tool chain that we have. And so we'll talk about the history of it and all the various fiddly bits. However, the lens that we view every problem, ServiceNow is our hammer. And every problem we have tends to look like a nail. So given the fact that it's kind of a drag to do a lot of the fiddly bits, what can we do with that? We can automate it. And IntegrationHub makes that easier, a lot easier. So Josh is going to tell us a little about where we started and how we kind of got to the tool chain that we have currently.
Yeah, so there was, going back to the very beginning, I think it was a Wednesday or a Thursday, I forget exactly which day it was. We were preparing some kind of a demo and we're like, well, should we just broadcast the process of doing this? And we're like, yeah, we should do that. And so the next day we did that. And at the time we were using, it was Google Hangouts on air. And Google Hangouts is, it's useful. It's quick and easy. You don't have to install any software. But we ran into lots of problems. We had issues with an audio delay. At one point, a 6-minute audio delay where things that were said before we actually clicked the live button were broadcast to everyone. That was fun. Way to go and clean that up.
We had a very, very panicky couple minutes when we figured out what we had said in that time period.
And nothing super bad, but just nothing that you want to have permanently on your YouTube
Off-brand channel. Might be the best way to describe it.
That's probably fair. So, we were going down this path. We were trying to figure out, which tools work the best. And a lot of the tools that seemed to be, just one click, everyone joins, didn't always work as well as we wanted it to. And then the other thing we were realizing is that we were very tightly tying ourselves to Google's products. And we know what Google likes to do to products at times. They sometimes just go away. So we went down this journey of how do we actually make this better? How do we come up with a live streaming setup that allows us to get multiple people involved, geographically dispersed, people aren't in the same room, get all of that somehow broadcast onto YouTube and Twitch at the same time and make all of that work. So, and then this next slide, this is what we're doing today. So we've got a Google Compute VM. This runs out there in Google's cloud. This is running a lot of horsepower and a lot of RAM. And the reason for that is this thing doesn't have a GPU, and I'll explain why that's important in a minute. On that VM, we're running Skype. And then everyone that participates in Live Coding Happy Hour has Skype on their computer. We have all of those connections, all those Skype participants in a call joined with that host machine. The host machine then talks to OBS, which is Open Broadcasting Software. This is a tool that allows you to send a stream to some sort of streaming site. We push that to Restream.io, which is a service that allows you to take a single stream and then push it out to multiple locations. And finally, that goes to Twitch and YouTube. So super simple, very straightforward, easy, not complicated at all. And the reason that VM is so big is because we're essentially live coding, or we're live transcoding and encoding a 1080p stream from all of these Skype conversations and then pushing that out to Restream. So we had to get a lot of horsepower behind that to make that work.
Right. The original version before we had the Google Compute Engine involved doing it on somebody's local laptop, which meant that you were doing all that on a MacBook, and then you're also pushing the stream back up whatever bandwidth you have in your going to your house, basically. And so, that could be problematic, and you're kind of tied to you had a lot of dependencies on you and, the network traffic that you're having that day. And so we kind of moved all that off our local machines, which helped with the runtime beefiness and bandwidth, and also really blew up the complexity. So that was the explicit trade-off we made.
And the reason we opted for that complexity was, for anyone who's watched the show a lot or has been with us since the beginning, we had some rough times. We'd be 10 minutes into the stream and something would drop out. Maybe the neighbor started downloading a movie and now the bandwidth was not there that needed to be, and it was not the experience that we wanted to provide for our viewers. And so that's why we went down this path.
All right, so now here's the problem where we're at. We've got the tool chain that we have. We have all of this stuff, and there's actually even another piece that kind of wasn't on that, which is we have an instance with an app that we use to manage our own content creation. So we've got a custom app we built that builds and schedules. We call it Artifact Manager, and whether it's a blog post or a webinar or whatever, or Live Coding Happy Hour, we keep track of the things the content we need to create and push out in the world. And so we have an entry in there. And what I do right now is that I am scheduling by hand, basically cutting and pasting. I'm entering it into one place, I'm cutting and pasting it into YouTube, and it's just messy. And then we've got all the things that happen as we're broadcasting. Where we're starting up a Google Compute VM, we're clicking live buttons on YouTube. There's a lot of fiddly bits at every stage. Then you've got a post-broadcast phase, which is where you finish, you finalize the video, you clean up, you get all your links. You've now gone from the live, that YouTube URL has gone from the live stream URL to now it's the archive URL, right? It's the same permalink, but now it's a different thing. It's no longer a live stream. And then we got the ongoing phase where we want to collect statistics. And so we pull back to that Artifact Manager things like likes and views and et cetera, so that we have one integrated view of all of our content. And everything that we have that is integratable, we have integrated so that we're getting that feedback back, right? So like I said, we're scheduling it in an Artifact Manager. We're creating the metadata. Then I'm in a different window with a different Chrome profile, logging into the account that owns the YouTube channel, right? So, all right, here's another different thing, which is I've got to have a different session than two sessions. My personal session and my work Google account, and now here's a third one, which is the ServiceNow Developer Program session, and I need that. I log into YouTube, I paste that. We have an index blog post that you have to go back and update that lives on our blog. We post to social media that and various places that this has been scheduled. Okay, so right there, a bunch of fiddly tasks. And then we go into the broadcast phase. We have a bunch more fiddly tasks. We log into Google. We do this with the ServiceNow developer account. We do the Google Compute VM. We do all the other stuff.
Yeah, we have to remote desktop in. We have to start Skype. We have to initiate the call to all the participants in Skype, and then we have to do post to social media. So just task after task after task after task, and it's a lot of busy work and a lot of things to remember. And there are a lot of moments where you're like, oh, did I forget that thing?
Did I paste the right data? Did I click the right button? There are a lot of buttons. Essentially, there's a lot of risk of human error in this. And like the show where we had the weird latency, that was because I did not click the right radio button one time and it went wrong. Instead of doing ultra low latency, I did low latency, or I had an option set wrong, and it made everything go crazy. So.
And then finally we have, whoa, did I hit the wrong direction? I think I did. I don't actually know how the clicker works.
All right.
So then we go into the post-broadcast phase where we have to do things like harvesting the live chat. So there are live chats that happen. We want to be able to go back and follow up on maybe questions that came in. And then we have to remember to shut down the VM. This is really important. When we first started this, we were on a free trial of the compute engine and forgot to shut down the VM over the weekend, and that was like a $150 mistake. And so it's one of those things where you want to make sure when you're using expensive resources that you have some kind of a plan in place to actually turn it off when you're finished. Cross-linking. So do we want to actually paste this link elsewhere? Do we want to find where people are posting this out there on the web? There's just lots of stuff there.
And then, as we go forward, like I said, we want to harvest the data. We want to, if we could, we like to do a little bit of, almost like the Google. I'm blanking on the thing. What's the Google thing that tells you when somebody mentions your name? A Google alert?
Yeah, like a Google.
Something like that. If we find somebody's referring to our URL, we'd like to know about it. If somebody has posted a blog or a social media or et cetera, we'd like to be able to find that. So that's the problem. That's the situation that we are in now. So again, given that we have this big hammer, what do? Solution? You automate. Because that's basically when in doubt, and you're doing a thing, and you don't want to do that, you don't want to click the buttons, and you don't want to cut and paste, you don't want to do the fiddly bits. The first thing we think about, because it's the lens through which we look at all problems, is how can we automate this? What can we integrate? Do the things that we're dealing with, do they have APIs? Hey, they do. Every one of these things has an API. So then what we go from there is we get into this. Is everyone familiar with this cartoon? The XKCD, the how long you spend automating a thing versus how often you do it. And you do that math and you figure out when do I break even on the time I spent writing the script to automate a thing that I do once every 3 weeks. And when in doubt, I will always be on the wrong side of this curve because you think, well gosh, the bash script is close, but it's not perfect. And then you realize, I could have actually done the task 100 times in the time that I spent doing the bash script. But there's just this philosophical, it doesn't hurt to write the bash script, and it hurts to do the thing over and over again. And so that's what we're trying to get out of. So we're going to fix that with Flow Designer and IntegrationHub.
So I guess the first question is, how many of you are familiar with IntegrationHub or have maybe played with IntegrationHub, just by show of hands? Oh, wow. So
this is what you call market potential. We have room for growth. So here's what we have got a lot of people for the Come to Jesus meeting here. So
yeah, so IntegrationHub. This is something that's relatively new. This was originally introduced in Kingston, and in Kingston there were a number of things that were released around the ability to make REST calls and whatnot. You'll see a little bit more concretely what this actually is as we get into the demo. But ultimately, the vision for IntegrationHub is to have a single place where you can manage both inbound and outbound integrations, deal with things like API management. How do you create reusable components? How do you make sure those components can be consumed by people that maybe aren't super familiar with some of the guts of the APIs and authentication and other things you have to deal with when you're building an integration? And so this slide is what we see as the future. Eventually we want to have a series of IntegrationHub content out there. These are called spokes. That's why this thing kind of looks like a wagon wheel, and each of those spokes goes out there and talks to a different API possibly.
Mm-hmm. So for those people not really familiar with IntegrationHub that haven't used it, you heard about the big announcement we made, 4 or 6 months ago, that we were having a partnership with Slack. Have you heard that announcement? That partnership is this spoke. This is the way that gets realized. Is what that means is when you spin up a new Kingston or greater ServiceNow instance, this is already there. That integration to Slack already exists, and you don't have to do anything to make it be there. That's the form of that partnership.
And so the steps that we actually took were to go out there and create spokes in IntegrationHub that solved the problems that we have with live coding happy hour. So specifically, we went out there and we started exploring on the YouTube side. What are the APIs that are available to us? We found out there's a data API, and there's an analytics API, and there's a broadcasting API, and APIs for everything. And so we decided to create a spoke for that. We also decided to create a spoke for Google Compute VM. So this is the process of actually starting the VMs and shutting the VMs down, possibly doing more complex management things. Every time the VM starts, it has a new IP address. That's another task that we have to deal with today. We have to go and figure out what was the IP address of the new VM so we can plug it into remote desktop and log in. And so we want to harvest that automatically. And then in the future, we want to get to a place where we're doing things like actually starting Skype, going into the VM and with PowerShell, starting Skype up, automatically initiating the calls back to the participants and things of that nature. And then actually initiating the streaming itself, where we would go and, are we actually ahead in our slides? I think we are.
I think, yeah.
I think this is, I've skipped straight to future plans when in reality, we're supposed to be on a demo right now.
But regardless, so what ultimately our goal is, kind of the short version of that is, our goal is every single fiddly thing we do now today, like in the ideal world, every one of those goes away. We do not enter anything, we do not type anything, we don't click anything other, in YouTube or Google Compute or any site other than our one artifact manager, right? We want that to be the central point. We essentially want that to be, the hub in the wheel. Everything else is touched from that point. We initiate everything from inside our one window, basically, right? So that's kind of like the dream that we're trying to realize, is that ultimately we click the buttons that we need to in our one application. Everything out in the world happens the way we want it to. So before we kind of go into the demo, does anybody have any questions about any of the stuff we've talked, like IntegrationHub conceptually or the spokes? There's a joke in there somewhere that we've never been able to formulate, that a spoke is a scope. So like you can't spell spoke without scope. I don't know. There's almost a one-to-one mapping, right? When we say a spoke is really a scope that contains a bunch of IntegrationHub Flow Designer stuff. So you'll notice that a spoke and a scope are almost synonymous, right? A scope can have more things than just the spoke, but a spoke is within one scope. Oh my God. Now you see, it's almost impossible. This is like Peter Piper picked a peck of...
I'm doing an IntegrationHub lab later today, and I actually have a joke. Say, try saying a spoke is a scope 10 times fast. Can't do it. So with that, we will transition into the demo. And if there are questions, yeah, there's a question.
We can talk about that. We can talk about actually, while you set up the demo, I'll talk about that a little bit. So the PowerShell doesn't exist now. Okay, so that is one of the things. So the people who have seen this before, we actually had a couple episodes of the live coding happy hour where we were trying to get the PowerShell to work, and cut one was a complete dumpster fire because I realized that I was trying to do all this work on the same VM that was actually already running all the stuff. And it just didn't work. Like trying to open the Skype window when I already had the Skype window doing the production, for some crazy reason, I didn't even consider that was the issue. And so
we're going to shut ourselves down accidentally.
We did turn ourselves off at one point. So we have, and we've gone back and forth on the best ways to do this, which is, okay, so somewhere we're going to have a mid server that's doing PowerShell kind of stuff. So do we want to have like a mid server on our local laptops? Like everybody's local laptop to initiate their own call, as well as a mid server on the VM. And one of the things we talked about at one point is, and Josh will have to go to the history of this. We set up the Windows VM. So that Google Compute VM is Windows, which trips me up every time because it is literally the only Windows machine in my life. And I don't even remember which thing I'm supposed to click to do what. And so at one point we had talked about, would it be easier to orchestrate if that was Skype? And we thought about, what if we set up a Skype VM, or if it was Linux? And we set up Linux with the Linux version of Skype, Linux version of OBS. All these exist. And would it be easier to orchestrate? Would it be easier for us to deal with? Could we SSH in and do some things? And then actually there were various reasons why that was tricky as well. So we're kind of balancing it out, which is I know nothing about PowerShell. Like the episodes where we were trying to do that, I got Craig Stepp, who is anybody, I don't know if he's kind of the ghost in the machine. Does anyone in this room know the name Craig Stepp? No one. Is anyone in here taking a workshop at any point during the week? Are you doing any hands-on labs? If you get a lab instance, that's because of Craig Stepp. He's like our orchestration wizard. So he and his team are responsible for spinning up, 60,000 instances over the course of 3 days, right? And so he was like what would you call it? He was the big guns I brought in. I'm like, all right, please help me orchestrate that. And we spent 2 hours trying to do this, and we had a hard time getting Skype to start because of things like when you're doing PowerShell, we don't want to open a headless copy of Skype. We need Skype up there on the screen, or else it's not going to be where OBS can pick it up. And we were actually creating a Skype process, but it didn't have a window component. And so I don't understand PowerShell enough to know how to change it. And so I was really failing at the lowest possible level, which is I just don't even know the PowerShell commands. So that was part of my desire to want to do this on Linux because I thought that it would be more understandable for me. But at the same time, setting up the Linux VM and getting the Linux to use Skype was actually kind of nightmarish in its own way. So it's really, I'm kind of picking my nightmares. I have a PowerShell nightmare or I have a Linux nightmare, and I'm not sure which nightmare I would rather have. So what I'm really doing is kind of minimizing the trouble in my life rather than maximizing the pleasure in them. So we're trying to figure this out one way or the other.
We can talk later about the PowerShell support that is coming in the future. So there's a lot of stuff around that's pretty exciting.
Do we need to do the safe harbor thing? Or?
There are plans for PowerShell.
We do not promise guarantees. I don't have this memorized. We are making no forward-looking statements, and we are not promising the delivery of anything in any specific version, and etc.
So with that, we will get into our demo. This is Artifact Manager. This is the application that Dave was mentioning at the beginning, where we go out there and we track all sorts of stuff: blog posts, live streams, podcasts, reblogs. Live coding happy hour is just one of those. So the basics of the Artifact are we have a title. This is what we're going to actually have show up on YouTube, and then an abstract, which is a short description of what that particular episode is going to be about. And then we'll choose, what's the actual start time, and some basic information about when this thing is going to happen. So what I'm going to demonstrate now is what it looks like to actually construct a flow in Flow Designer that leverages components from IntegrationHub to go out there and first automatically schedule a broadcast on YouTube. So I'm going to go into Flow Designer.
Before Josh does that, we actually had a big idea for this that we didn't. It was a big idea that fell apart in the planning stage because it was too much work. But one of the things we wanted to do was have a video of me doing everything the way it is now, capture my screen as I start from this point, and then do a time lapse, while we're talking about this, so you see click, 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 move, click, 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 to actually show that there is a lot of moving parts to this, and that's why really the number of clicks and keystrokes it takes to make this happen is in the hundreds, right? And that's why it's so important. More than anything, there's a reason why I care about this more than anyone in the world, which is I'm the one doing those 100 clicks and keystrokes.
Yes, indeed. So what I've got here is a new flow. New flow has properties. In this case, we're just going to say schedule a broadcast on YouTube. We're creating this in our Artifact Manager application. If you've done things in other parts of the platform before, this is one of my favorite things about Flow Designer and IntegrationHub is you can actually choose the scope you want to put this thing in.
It's not the implicit one that's in the header.
It's pretty
Unlike
helpful.
Everything else in the platform, when you realize you're in the wrong scope and you just created something in the scope you didn't intend,
exactly.
You can actually create it in whichever scope you specify.
This is an empty flow, and flows are made up of triggers and actions. And then on the right-hand side, we have what's called the data pane. And we'll sort of see this build out as we go. So I'm going to create a trigger, and we're going to say that anytime a record is created or updated, we're going to choose the artifact table, and then we're going to set some conditions. So we don't want every artifact, and we don't want artifacts that aren't in a certain state. So we'll say type is live stream, and then we'll say status or state is ready to publish. So this gives us an opportunity to have sort of a draft artifact we could then put to ready to publish later. Now what's going to happen is every time an artifact is created or updated that actually meets this criteria, Let me change this to always. This is something that trips people up. If it's once, it's only going to execute once. We want this thing to execute every time this becomes true.
The first time I did a public demo of Flow Designer was at a ServiceNow developer meetup in Boston. And this setting right here gave me heart palpitations for about 2 hours when I could not understand why my demo, which just worked, stopped working. And I realized I had that set in the run once state. So I'd keep updating my record, and it would never trigger. And I'm like, but this worked. And then I would pick a new record, and it would work. And then it wouldn't work, and it wouldn't work, and it wouldn't work. And so this seemingly innocuous little drop-down really can make the difference between a good day and a bad day. So this is a good one to pay attention to.
Yes. So now what we can do is we can add actions. And so down at the bottom, there are a number of things you can add. You could add actions, you could add flow logic, and you can add subflows. And we'll see each of these as we go through the demo. So,
and a caveat that we are looking at London here, are we not?
Yes, we are looking at London here. You will see London throughout various labs and demos this week. All of the things Dave mentioned apply.
So you're going to see some things if you have like a Kingston or personal developer instance, and you go and look at IntegrationHub. You will see things in this demo that are not in there, because this is a London pre-release build.
So what we have here is the Action Explorer, and this allows you to, as the name suggests, explore all the actions that are available to you on the platform. And so this is everything from on-platform things like look up records, submit log, put things in the logs, ask for approval, to IntegrationHub actions. These are the things with these icons. So things like I want to go and make a call to Microsoft Teams, or I want to do something in Microsoft Azure AD.
Actually, let's stop for 1 second and let's actually define some terms here. Define the difference between Flow Designer and IntegrationHub.
So Flow Designer and IntegrationHub are essentially the same thing.
They're like
There's a continuum somewhere in there whereby an action becomes IntegrationHub when it starts making API calls. So if your action is talking to external systems, it's an IntegrationHub action. There is actually an extra plugin you have to turn on to enable that. So if you're making a REST call, that REST step just doesn't show up unless the IntegrationHub plugin has been activated. Mm-hmm. What's really interesting about this is when you think about actually using Flow Designer doesn't have to talk to external systems, but it can. And the experience for talking to external systems is the same, or essentially the same, as talking to or working with internal stuff inside the platform. So it's a very sort of seamless experience. You're coming in and out of ServiceNow without necessarily always even realizing it. So in this case, the first thing that we wanted to do is we've got our YouTube spoke. And we've created a number of actions inside of this YouTube spoke. And so we want to schedule a broadcast. So I'll click this. This then gives me my action form, and this allows me to fill out some details. I've actually defined all of these things previously, and we'll dig into that in a little bit. I can choose some things from the artifact. So in this case, I'm going to go to this thing called the data pill picker. I can say, for the artifact that I created, I want to take the title and use that title when I'm actually putting something into YouTube. And so it's that easy. This is called a data pill. This is sort of dynamically coming in. The next thing is we'll take the start time from that artifact record. So let's go down to the start time. Just drag that over. The description is going to be the abstract from the artifact record. And then finally, privacy status is going to be private.
And so you'll notice this UI element. So very few people in the room have used Flow Designer. Has anyone in the room used the automated testing framework? Right. This is the same thing, right? So this is kind of a concept that's now, once it was kind of introduced, it's now kind of becoming a de facto standard. If you think about it, IntegrationHub and automated test framework have pretty similar models, right? They're a series of steps of things that happen that have inputs and outputs. And so the output from one step feeds into the input of another step, and this is the mechanism. So Josh, being in the role he is, can only use, has to use the official name, which is data pill picker. Does anybody else call that thing anything different? Because I always call it the cannonball, because I think that's funny to call it the cannonball.
They think so too next door.
Yes, people next door loves it. The martini in the glass, the martini and olive is one that I've heard. The ball and joint. Does that jump out as anything to anybody? In your organization, does that? It's kind of become just abstract enough that it doesn't, it becomes its own thing, But I still to this. Say what? Cannonball. I like cannonball. So I am not a manager of the brand, but I personally like to call it the cannonball because I think it's funny and it makes me laugh.
So the next thing at this point is we want to, this thing has been scheduled, we want to send some details back to our Slack channel. And because we want to say, hey, we actually scheduled this thing, we need to have a reference to what that was. So what I'm going to do is I have a simple Slack webhook that I set up for my Slack channel. This is something that Slack makes very easy.
And let's actually pause on that for a little bit. So as you're setting that up, we'll note, so because a lot of people haven't seen this, prior to Flow Designer and IntegrationHub, there was no reason why you couldn't integrate to Slack. You could, in fact, integrate to Slack, right? It's an API. You could do this. And in fact, there's another session where people are talking about doing stuff prior to Flow Designer where they had the Slack integration. You'll notice the amount of information that it takes in IntegrationHub to integrate to Slack, which is you have basically a webhook, one webhook URL, you have one message. That's the only required fields. What's not there? Authorization, configuration, there's all kinds of stuff that you don't even need. And so part of the whole value chain of Flow Designer and IntegrationHub is you're doing the same work that was available, but how long would it have taken you to get your Slack integration working prior to this? It's not impossible. It's going to take you, I don't know, somewhere between an hour and a day probably. But with this, it's going to take you somewhere between a minute and 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes. So it's not net new functionality, but it's like an extreme lowering of friction to get things done. And that is kind of where Flow Designer is coming from. It's one of those tools that is it's kind of exists to be usable by like a business owner or a process owner that doesn't need to know. They don't want to know about. In fact, they would freak out if they heard the term OAuth. They don't even want to know that exists. So they're like, I'm not listening. Just tell me what to do. Give me the one URL that I need to know, and then we'll go from there. So if you have, say, like somebody that owns the HR process and they want to send a Slack notification from some HR thing, they can just do this, and they don't have to know any technical implementation details. We're basically abstracting that away from people.
So with that, I'm going to hit the test button with some consternation. One of the things that happens on Live Coding Happy Hour all the time is stuff just doesn't work. So we'll see what happens here. So we'll click test.
Before we do that, let's talk about the things that could go wrong. We tried very hard to make sure that our credentials were alive and have not expired. We have an OAuth credential that will time out. We hit the button. Josh hit the button like at 10:25, I think, to reduce that. We've got demo data.
So we've got a special edition of Live Coding Happy Hour. We're going to click this. We're going to process the test flow.
It's taking a while, which is a great sign.
That is a good sign. Now, the next thing I'm going to show you is possibly one of my favorite things about Flow Designer and IntegrationHub, which is the integrated operations and debugging experience. So after you've executed a test flow, I'm going to click here. Hopefully everything's green. It's not. And that's okay, because what this does is this allows us to sort of show you what this operations view looks like.
And to back up 1 second before we do that, you'll notice that Josh picked a record right out of that table. We've got this defined as a trigger on a record. So when you pick one of those records from that when you're running a test, that's the record. It's essentially forcing that to be the trigger record, right? So you're picking an arbitrary one. So it kind of saves you a step of having to go ahead and actually touch the record to trigger a test.
Yeah, and that's extremely helpful, from this repeatability of your testing and not having to go to other places to figure out how to get this thing to go. So inside of this operations view, we've got a number of things. We've got details about what's actually configured. So what were the things that I set in the action at the time? Then we have the actual runtime values. So what were the values that made it through? So if you look here on the left-hand side, I've got the trigger record. On the right-hand side, we see the actual values that were sent. We can then look at the logs. These all come into one place. I don't have to go back to the logs table or exit this environment to find those. And then we can also look at the individual steps. So if I go underneath the steps, I can figure out, okay, where is this problem actually occurring? And it turns out that the problem is happening inside of this first step. This is a script step. And that the REST call itself was never even executed. So this allows us to immediately zero in on where did the problem occur, Where do I need to go and tweak my code to actually figure out what that looks like? So with that, what we can now do is we'll go back to our flow. And because this action's not working, I can dive into the action and we can see what's actually happening inside of it. So if I open the Action Designer, you'll notice that this interface is now pretty familiar or pretty similar to what we saw a moment ago, but this is the developer's view. So if you're a developer, you're building actions that are meant to be reusable, this is where you're going to spend your time. And this gives you access to a lot more technical, sort of lower level constructs that you wouldn't want a business user to have to worry about. So things like, I want to build a payload by running a script. And in this case, we've got some sort of a script that we've built out, and then we're setting an output from that. We're saying, take this script object, do a JSON.stringify, then we're going to pass that to our REST step, and we're going to set that into our REST step and put that into the body of that request. From the response of this request, we want to run something to actually check to see what was the HTTP code that came back. And then finally, we want to extract the ID. So what was the ID of the thing that we actually created inside or on the YouTube side? On the right side, you'll see this data pane, and this data pane gives us things like what were the input variables that were defined for that particular action. We can then see a lot of additional detail that we would never expose to a business user, like the response body itself, or the status code, or headers that came back from that REST request. This all lives inside the action. You can use these things as you're building your action, but you don't necessarily want to expose those to your users, and so finally we have outputs. And in this case, we just have two. We want to give back the ID, we want to give back the YouTube URL that we actually created.
I like to say that the whole Flow Designer experience is like a fractal, right? The way the steps the action is made of look a lot like the actions the flow is made of. So like you keep drilling down and it looks just the same with a very similar interface with inputs and outputs chaining together, and whether that's steps, atomic steps in an action, then the accumulated actions in the flow. It's all pretty much the same interface with the same kind of usage model.
So with that, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at this privacy status thing. What happened was we created an action earlier. I didn't publish it. That's bad on me. So I'm going to publish that now.
Oh, that's...
And we'll see if this thing runs through. And then if it does, we're great. And if it's not,
we're going to move on. And, dismissed as lightning. So that's one thing, and that's another philosophical thing about when you go out and we have at this point logged, I don't know, hundreds of hours of live coding. That it takes a special kind of mindset to approach, because step one, you have to be willing to look really stupid in public. Because I'm trying to think of the things I have blanked on. I have blanked on how you create a glide record in the middle of the thing. Is it new glide record table? Is that the thing? I've the simplest things. I forgot how to initialize an array, a JavaScript array one time. It's like, what? Guys, help me out here.
Yeah, we've had a lot of fun ones. Then you go back and you look at it later and you're like, really? That's all it was? It was so simple.
But here's the flip side. The number of times I have known that we have done something, and I cannot remember how we did it. And I said, I'm going to pull up the video and I'm going to scrub until I see that on the screen. From what was one of the things that, that's a problem we've had in here, is transforming dates. Trying to do things, there's something I was going to say, who's official in this room? Using glide date, the combination of glide date, and glide time will drive anyone to drink. And you want to come talk to me after, at 6 o'clock tonight, I'll buy you with that drink, because
glide date time therapy.
And one of the things we did a long time ago is we figured out, if you import moment.js, you can just use that to, don't even use glide date to transform anything. Create a moment object with that, and then just do something, and it'll do the time zones, and you can do everything with it. And but I can never remember the syntax of how you do that in Moment. So over and over and over again, I've been inflating our own view count on that one particular video, because I go back and I was like, I know it's around 20 minutes. I do the thing, and I scrub. I was like, oh, there's the thing. Okay. And so it's kind of an expensive in bandwidth way to get myself, one line of code. But I've gone back to that over and over again. The other thing I've done is, what instance were we doing that code on? I don't remember. So you go back and you look at the URL in the video. So There is, if anybody is interested in doing this, there are actually some upsides from having a public record of you doing your coding. Like even if you did a private video, something like that, it's actually, like for internal purposes, it's not a terrible idea. That's a little outside the scope of this, but like we're big on live coding. There's a lot of upsides to it.
And with all of that said, and the little bit of live coding that we just did for you right now, which was totally planned, we have a successful action. We have scheduled the thing on YouTube. We executed our Slack webhook, and we have a message in Slack. And what's crazy about this is that we have done so little. I mean, if you look at what we actually did on that flow, we essentially put 2 actions on, filled a few inputs, and hit a button, and that was it. And now we have data going from YouTube to Slack. It's kind of crazy.
Pop open YouTube for 1 second.
Yeah, so let's go to the YouTube side. Let me look at my live events. I've got one in there from earlier. And then now we've got special edition of Live Coding Happy Hour at CreatorCon. So there we go. We've scheduled it. And this is the part that, is just, again, copy paste. Move things back and forth. Not a lot of fun. But there's more. So let me get to the rest of our demo, because I think we have, 10 minutes left?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Do we stop at 20 after or half an hour? I think we stop at 20 after. So.
Yeah, so we've got a little bit of time. And what I showed you there was what happens when you actually schedule the thing. But there's another thing, which is how do you actually start the VM on a Friday? Long enough before things actually get started so that if the VM needs to run Windows updates, it gets those out of the way before we're actually live. And the VM's not shutting itself down while we're live. That's definitely never happened before. So we will create another flow, and this flow is just going to be launch VM on Friday. And we're going to put this into that artifact manager spoke, or scope, because it's not really a scope at that point, but anyway, or a spoke at that point. See, I'm getting myself confused. And this time, this is going to be not a record trigger, but a scheduled trigger. And so a schedule, you can say, I want to run this thing daily or weekly or monthly or whatever the case is. And so we're going to say we're going to run this every week on a Friday at 12 p.m. So it gives us a little bit of time to actually, let the thing run before live coding starts. And we're going to do a few things. So we're going to use an on-platform action to look up records. So this is one of those things that doesn't require IntegrationHub. This is just part of Flow Designer. And I want to look up records in the artifact table where type is live stream. And that live stream is actually happening today. So start time is on today. And then we want to do some flow logic. So this is where you can start to do things like an if condition to say, if the count of the previous thing is greater than 1, so I actually found a record, now I want to act on it. So I'll drag the count, or I'll pick the count here, that's a little bit easier. So if count is greater than 0, we don't want greater than 1, we want greater than 0. Then we'll do a series of actions. And we'll go out to the Google Compute Engine. And first thing is we'll start an instance. Now, in a production scenario, if I weren't doing this in a demo, I would put these values into a CI so that we're not sort of hard coding them here. But so if you look at the documentation for the Google Compute APIs, it's really complex. There's a massive amount of information you have to sort through to actually get to the point of how do I just do something simple. And you'll notice in this case, I've just exposed 3 things. These are the 3 things that matter. These are the 3 things that are needed to actually start this. Now I'm going to kick off this instance that's actually running our thing. I'm going to do another action that is get some information about that instance. So get instance info. We're going to actually just copy and paste those same 3 values.
And you'll notice, although Josh is kind of pasting them hard-coded, you could have some kind of logic. Like you could, if you had records, like if you had these in CIs and you wanted to say balance the regions or something like that, or you wanted to start it up in more than one region, right? That could be a dynamic variable that you pass into that, right? You could have that assigned at runtime instead of picking it at config time, basically.
And then finally, after this is all done, we want to post something to that Slack channel again to say, hey, we've started the VM. Also, here's the IP address because you might need that to log in. So live coding VM started. IP address is, whoa, I'm activating Siri in my demo. Let's turn that off. Go away. IP address is from the instance info. All we've done is we've exposed the IP address. We've sort of filtered out the things that we don't care about.
Right, that Google Compute, that start action, does all the side effects and then returns one value, which is the IP address that results from that, the external IP address that results from that.
So we'll run this test.
Again,
and
it's taking a while, which is a good sign.
It is a good sign. It means we haven't gotten a access denied or something else. So we've got all green. So we looked up the records. We found a record. We decided that because there's a live stream happening today, we'll start this thing up. And now if we go and look at Slack, we've got another thing. So live coding VM started, and here's the IP address. The other thing is, so going back to, we were looking at the this view earlier from a troubleshooting standpoint, but this is also useful as an admin or as somebody who wants to come in later and sort of inspect the history of what's happened. You can do that as well. So in this case, we have all those same details that we saw before. We can see the information, the inputs and the outputs of each of these actions, sort of all in one place. So with that, the other thing I'll bring up here is you can open these actions, and these actions are really simple. So while it took a lot of time to sort of get through the Google API docs and whatnot, these actions are really a couple of things. We've got inputs, we've got a REST step, and in this case, that REST step is building out a resource path. I think this is kind of cool. That's why I want to show it off, where we're able to use those data pills in the process of building that resource path in line. So we don't have to create variables and then come back later and say, go and find that string and replace it with something else. This is just sort of, you're building it in line.
Right, and this is like, this could be really complex if you were doing this, and now all that's abstracted away from the user.
So that's pretty much it. So we've gotten to the point now where we're scheduling our broadcast. That was taking a lot of time. We're starting our VM. That was taking a lot of time. We don't have time today to demonstrate what it would look like to shut that VM down, but essentially it's the same thing, where we would pick a time at the end of the day after our thing has been done. We'd run our flow. We'd schedule our flow so that we could turn that VM off and make sure that we're not ticking away, spending a lot of money on something we don't want to be.
Because that demo, that trial period is over, and this is actual cash.
It's real money now.
It's real money on my P
card. Going on the real budget. And I guess we have 50 episodes now, so it's kind of a thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and one other thing is, so we're working on these things. These are not, not ready to roll. At some point, our intention is to publish these out to somewhere where people can download it. I guess on Share. We don't even know exactly where they would go.
Yeah, it would be Share.
Probably on Share. But both the Google Compute and the YouTube Spoke, at the point where we get it productized, is I believe, and so you could actually, you have the ability in your hand to make this a false statement for me, but I would like us to be the first Spoke on Share. But if you are able to beat us to it, then you deserve it. But I would really like to be able to have the bragging rights of the first Flow Designer and IntegrationHub Spoke anyone has ever published to the world like this.
That would be awesome. And the other thing is if you look at the vision of IntegrationHub and the architecture of how it's been built exactly for that. It's so that you can create these things that you can share. So often you'll build an integration. It's very specific to your organization, your business problem, your company, whatever the case is, and you can't really share it because it's tied tightly to some business process that nobody else is necessarily interested in, or maybe there's IP. The design of a Spoke and IntegrationHub is to be completely separate from that business process. So you talk to the API, and that's self-contained, and it doesn't contain proprietary information. It's just, how do I talk to that API? And now you can safely share that. You can now, it makes it a lot easier to create things that are reusable in the community. And it's, as an integration nerd, this is what I've been doing for the last 6 years, is building integrations on ServiceNow. This is just crazy exciting.
So really, the top takeaways, and we'll take questions until we get kicked out of the room. Essentially, what we did here was we identified a pain point, and we said, what can we do to make as much of that pain go away? We built a solution. We're building it to be reusable. Like, as you saw, we're trying to abstract away anything specific to us because we would like you to be able to use this exactly the way we're using it. So we're trying to keep a close eye on, are we building in something that is applicable only to us, or is this generally useful? And we're using things like that Slack API as a model. It's like, expose as little as possible, require as little as possible, make it as generic as possible from the outer level of the person building a flow. And then if you've got a thing that you want to do with an integration with logic like this that happens, IntegrationHub and Flow Designer will get you there faster. So you'll notice we have two types of triggers currently, record-based triggers, time-based triggers, which means this is kind of overlaps with business rules. It kind of overlaps with scheduled jobs. It kind of overlaps with workflow. There's not a single story. It's a kind of a Venn diagram where some of the things that any of those things could do may be more appropriate in Flow Designer, and they may not be. It's kind of a case-by-case decision. But it's a thing that's available for you, and it gets a lot of good stuff done fast. All right, any questions? Yes? There is, in fact, a flow chart. One of the biggest, so the question is workflow or flow, Flow Designer flow.
Well, and custom activities in particular.
Yeah,
so right. I think the thing to say there is that IntegrationHub will get to a point where it reaches parity with orchestration. It's not there yet. That is the vision. And so there will be a time where this makes the most sense because it's the fastest and the easiest thing to do. Today, you pretty much have to look and say, what are the things that you need to do? Are they in IntegrationHub? If yes, then that's a good direction to go.
Right. Step one is, do the capabilities I need exist? And that may actually exclude Flow Designer, today.
If you want to do SSH, it's not there right now. So that's kind of the decision process. Yeah. So planned in London will be mid-service
Safe harbor.
support.
Blah 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 blah.
So that's currently on the plans. Mid-service support. Full first-class mid-service support. Running flows on the instance or on the mid.
Yes, starting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so the question is, would you, if you're starting new, would you use IntegrationHub versus all the core platform capabilities that are there today? So I think the same answer somewhat applies, which is part of this is going to depend on, is the thing that you need there? Kingston doesn't support mid-servers, as an example. So that support will get added on. I think it's really just going to be looking at that situation. And then do you want to create something that's reusable? Do you want these actions that are reusable, or is it sort of a more bespoke solution? So it's tools in the toolbox. And I don't think there's a clear answer as to you should do this or you should do that. But hopefully over time, you'll start to see that it just makes sense to use IntegrationHub because it's the easiest thing to do.
All right, and with that, I think we are out of time or in overtime. So thank you all for attending. And thank you for the DevOps people who stuck around anyway. I appreciate that.